Chapter 25: Population Growth and the Stock of Capital. The amount of physical capital, equipment, and buildings available to a worker influences his or her output and income. Non-physical capital, such as the education, skill, and dedication of the worker, whether at a machine or at a desk, is very important too, and we shall discuss it shortly. But the availability of machinery, buildings, and other physical capital certainly has a strong effect on the amount of goods and services that a person can produce. People must save some part of their income in order to build a stock of capital. Therefore, the amount we save from our present incomes influences our future incomes and consumption. And population growth and size may influence the amount of saving. Population affects our stock of physical capital both positively and negatively. On balance, the effect is positive. The productivity of the equipment available for purchase at a given moment also is affected by population size. A larger population and a higher income level increases the demand for new capital goods to be invented and developed, and a larger population also increases the supply of new inventors, both of which lead to more efficient equipment. So by way of the forces of both supply and demand, a larger population increases the technology of capital goods. More about that in the next chapter. Simple theory and data. Let us start the analysis with a given population of workers and a given supply of physical capital, a given farm acreage, a given number of factories, and a given number of machines. If the number of workers increases, then the supply of capital will be diluted. That is, if there are more workers, there is less capital available for each worker to use. If there is less capital per worker, output and income per worker will fall. This Malthusian dilution effect is one of the main liabilities of additional population. The extent of the loss can be calculated easily. Twice as many workers with the same capital implies half as much capital per worker. In a typical modern economy, this would reduce each worker's output and hence income by about 1/3. Population growth also may reduce the available capital per worker because, in order to build and maintain a stock of capital, people must save part of their incomes. Savings can come directly from individuals and businesses, and some of the money extracted as taxes can also be saved by the government. We shall focus on individual saving, however. A higher birth rate was long thought to reduce the rate of individual saving simply because an additional child is a burden on the family's income. This line of argument assumes that additional children induce parents to give a higher priority to immediate consumption, baby shoes now, than to later consumption, a trip around the world after retirement. That is, parents with, say, 5 hungry children were assumed to spend more out of income and hence save less than with, say, 2 children. The basis for this assumption is simply the psychological guess that more children mean more pleas, requests, and demands, pressure that shifts the parents' preferences in such a way that they spend more of their income sooner. But there may also be an opposing effect. More children may induce parents to forego some luxuries in order to save for the children's future needs. For example, a college education. The former line of argument implicitly, but wrongly, assumes that earning opportunities are fixed, so that a greater number of children cannot induce parents to go out and work more. But to assume that income is fixed, rather than variable in response to the number of children, also is unrealistic. It is well documented that the more children men have, the more they work. So too, women after their children are no longer young. Assuming income to be fixed is particularly inappropriate for subsistence agriculture. A large portion of agricultural saving, especially the clearing of new land and the construction of irrigation systems, is accomplished through the farmer's own labor, and this is usually added to the labor they expend in raising their crops. Population growth stimulates this extra labor, and hence adds to the community's stock of capital. The effects of more children on governmental saving may also be important. It is often assumed that in poor countries, governments have less power to tax if people have more children, because the competition in the family budget between feeding children and paying taxes is then more acute. One can also reason in the opposite direction, however. If there are more children, governments may be able to extract more in taxes because people recognize a greater need for taxes to buy additional schools and other facilities. The number of children may also affect the kinds of investments that governments make. For example, an increase in children may induce a government to invest more, but much of this increase might be in housing and other demographic investment at the expense of the sort of capital investment that will immediately increase the production of goods. The statistical evidence about the effect of population growth upon the savings rate is as mixed and inconclusive as the theorizing. Taken together, the data suggests that a population increase may slightly reduce the formation of industrial capital, but this is probably not an important effect. The efficiency of capital, as well as the quantity of it, is also important. And there has recently developed a strong body of evidence showing that capital is used more efficiently in larger communities. For example, less capital is needed for a given amount of productivity per person in larger cities. This jibes with the fact that wages are higher in bigger cities in a sample of countries. Further, interest rates are lower in bigger cities, which implies that capital is cheaper. In sum, the evidence suggests that one can get more output from a given capital investment where there are more people. When we think about the effect of additional children on the supply of capital, it is crucial that we keep in mind farm capital and social overhead capital, as well as industrial capital. In Chapter 28, we shall see that the supply of farm capital, especially arable land, increases when population increases because people respond to the demand for additional food with increased investment, much of which is additional labor to clear trees and stones, dig ditches, and build barns. The effect of additional persons on the supply of capital is most marked with respect to social overhead capital, such as roads, which are crucial for the economic development of all countries and especially poor countries. Here, the effect of population is sharply positive, especially in less developed countries. The transportation connection. If there is a single key to economic development other than economic liberty, that key is the transportation and communication system. Transportation obviously includes roads and railways and airlines, which carry agricultural and industrial products, as well as persons and messages. It also includes irrigation and electrical systems, which transport water and power. There is abundant testimony by scholars of contemporary and historical economic development that the one sure generalization about the underdeveloped countries is that investment in transport and communications is a vital factor. Enabling farmers and businesses to sell in organized markets and to deliver output and obtain delivery of inputs at reasonable cost is crucial to a developing economy. A comparison of the costs of transportation by various methods is illuminating. Examples: 1. Canal transportation cost only 25 to 50% as much as land transportation between cities in England about 1790. 2. In August 1799, a courier set out from Detroit to deliver U.S. Army muster rolls to headquarters in Pittsburgh, perhaps 200 miles. His trip took 53 days of hard riding. 3. Carrying loads on human backs is 17 times as expensive as by ship or train, on average. See Table 25-1. Such cost differences greatly affect the amounts of merchandise transported and the prices at various distances from the producer. Lack of a good transportation system presents an enormous barrier against development. In the early 19th century U.S., for example, farm products could be transported only where there were natural waterways. As for overland transport, the cost was so high that even if corn had cost nothing to produce, it could not have been marketed 20 miles from where it was grown. It was cheaper to move a ton of iron across the Atlantic than to carry it 10 miles through Pennsylvania. But the Erie Canal reduced freight rates from New York City to the Great Lakes from $100 to $15 per ton. Similarly, in 18th century France, food would not normally be transported more than 15 kilometers from its place of origin. Flour that sold for $10 or $20 a barrel on the East Coast cost $100 a barrel in Ohio. Coal cost 3 or 4 times as much in Philadelphia as at the mine heads in western Pennsylvania. Such inability to transport food from farms to large markets caused a large difference between at-the-farm prices and market prices, and was responsible for frequent local famines, even when food was plentiful a short distance away. My 1977 book gives a variety of other historical and contemporary examples of how improved transportation systems have stimulated agriculture and improved the efficiency of industry in various countries. Transportation is also important in the flow of information, technical agricultural know-how, birth control, health services, modernizing ideas, and so forth. It makes an enormous difference if a particular village in India can be reached with a truck, or even a jeep or a bicycle, rather than just by a bullock, with which a trip to the big city is out of the question. Most villages in countries such as India and Iran cannot easily be reached by motor transportation. When transportation is improved, radical developmental changes will occur. There is great room for improvement in poor countries' transportation systems, especially local rural transportation. This may be seen by a comparison between countries with well-developed agriculture and countries where agriculture is less developed. In agriculturally advanced Western countries, there are from 3 to 4 miles of farm-to-market roads per square mile of cultivated land. In India, there is only about 0.7 of a mile of road per square mile of cultivated land. In Malaya, it is about 0.8 mile, and in the Philippines about 1 mile. None of the developing countries that are dependent on agriculture has sufficient rural access roads. And in industrial areas too, the low transportation and communication costs in larger cities lead to their higher productivity compared with smaller cities. The effect of population on transportation systems. Population density and the system of transporting goods, people, and information influence each other. On the one side, a dense population makes a good transportation system both more necessary and more economical. Having twice as many people in a village implies that twice as many people will use a wagon path if it is built, and twice as many hands can contribute to building the path. This is what happened on the continent and in England, where the growth of population made it worthwhile to improve and create transport facilities. On the other hand, a better transportation system brings an increased population and probably leads at first to higher birth rates because of a higher standard of living. But later the birth rates drop, as we have seen in Chapter 24. Furthermore, good transportation connections are likely to reduce a village's death rate because the village is less vulnerable to famine. The opposite condition, population sparsity, makes traveling slow and difficult. This is how it was near Springfield, Illinois, when Abraham Lincoln was a lawyer riding the circuit of courts. Traveling was a real hardship, so real that the words of old lawyers describing early days become fresh and vivid when the circuit is the subject. Between Fancy Creek and Postville, near Lincoln, wrote James C. Conkling, there were only 2 or 3 houses. Beyond Postville, for 13 miles, was a stretch of unbroken prairie, flat and wet, covered with gopher hills, and apparently incapable of being cultivated for generations. For 15 or 18 miles this side of Carlinville, the country was of a similar character, without a house or improvement along the road. For about 18 miles between South Fork and Shelbyville, there was only one clearing. I have traveled between Decatur and Shelbyville from 9 o'clock in the morning until after dark over a country covered with water from recent rains without finding a house for shelter or refreshment. Donald Glover and I made a cross-national study of the relationship between road density and population density, and we found that relationship to be very strong, as Figure 25.1 shows. Population growth clearly leads to an improved transportation system, which in turn stimulates economic development and further population growth. This unexciting but important statistical finding cannot, of course, match in dramatic appeal the photographs that purportedly show population growth to be an unmitigated evil. A picture of an emaciated, starving child is surely tragic and compelling, but it conveys no verifiable information as to why that child is suffering, as likely for the lack of a good road and the medical attention it could bring as for any other reason. Though the statistical fact is less exciting, it reveals an irrefutable story, the enormous social benefits of population growth. Yet it is the picture of the emaciated child that appears in the popular press and remains in people's minds. When roads and other infrastructure become burdened and congested with an increased population and the traffic that accompanies increased income, a variant of the basic theoretical process described in this book comes into play. More people and increased income cause problems of strained capacity in the short run. This causes transportation prices to rise and communities to become concerned. This same state of affairs also presents opportunity to businesses and to ingenious people who wish to contribute to society by improving roads, vehicles, and services, or inventing new forms of transportation. Many are unsuccessful, at cost to themselves. But in a free society, new facilities are eventually designed and built, and in the long run, the new facilities leave us better off than if the problems had not arisen. That is, prices end up lower, and access to transportation becomes greater than before the congestion occurred. The development of the Panama Canal passage from the Atlantic to the Pacific illustrates the theory. When the canal was first opened, the locks were considered larger than would ever be needed. By 1939, the locks were too small to handle ships then being built, and the volume of shipping was straining capacity, so the canal was modified. An addition was planned and begun, but halted by World War II. Now, the Panama Canal is so inadequate that some ships go around South America at the Straits of Magellan. Hence, a new canal probably will be built, and the new one will probably be at sea level rather than using locks to lift ships up and down over the terrain, which will be a great improvement. Population density brings a similar increase in the efficiency of communications, easily seen in a comparison of cities of very different sizes. For the same price to the reader, the daily newspaper is much larger and supplies much more information in, say, a big city like Chicago than in smaller Illinois cities. There are generally more radio and television programs available to people in larger cities, though cable television has made this more equal. And the price charged an advertiser, whether a department store or an individual seeking employment, is much lower per 1,000 readers reached in a large city than in a small city, a clear benefit stemming from a larger population. See Figure 25-2. Summary: population growth is responsible for great improvements in the social infrastructure, especially in the transportation and communications systems that are crucial to economic development. Growth also gives a boost to agricultural saving. Population growth may or may not reduce non-agricultural saving. This is still a matter of scientific controversy. For readers who wish more detail, chapters 2, 3, 10, 11, and 12 in my technical 1977 book cover the effects of population growth on capital. Afternote: A Parable of Population Growth, Racquetball, and Squash. This parable was written in 1980. Nothing in it has changed in the book's second edition, except the last paragraph. There are 23 wonderful handball racquetball courts on the Urbana campus of the University of Illinois, and 7 excellent squash courts, in addition to a batch of old courts. The new racquetball courts are frequently crowded nowadays, though not so badly that people complain a lot. From time to time, however, players worry about the future growth of the university, saying that it is going to be tough to get a racquetball court, and I have heard people argue against increasing the number of students for that reason. The racquetball court situation exemplifies the country's situation with respect to population growth and the supply of capital. If there come to be more people, there will immediately be an increased demand for the courts. It will also be harder to find parking space and perhaps a job. That is, the immediate effect of an increase in population is an increase in congestion. The individual suffers because of the greater competition for the good things that are available and because of the greater out-of-pocket costs of providing more of these good things to take care of the added population. This increase in costs is inevitable and undeniable. But now let us take a slightly longer view. Why are players so lucky as to have 23 wonderful racquetball courts and 7 squash courts at the University of Illinois? Years ago, there were 16 dingy, wrong-sized courts to be used for both sports together. But then came a rapid population growth at the university. The superb new facilities were built in response to that population growth, though at a considerable cost to the taxpayers and students at that time. So players are now reaping the benefits of the rapid population growth in the past, and at the same time talking against further population growth so that they do not have to share this stock of capital, the benefits of past population growth, with more people, and so that the taxpayers do not have to cough up the investment necessary for additional population growth. There is nothing illogical about this point of view. As the sage Hillel put it, "If I am not for myself, who will be for me?" But if we see ourselves as part of a longer historical process than this instant of our own consciousness, and if we take into account the welfare of ourselves and our children in the years to come, as people before us took our welfare into account, then we will see that we ought to cooperate and put back as well as take from the pot. As Hillel added, "But if I am for myself alone, what am I?" Our children may well have more racquetball courts in the future, and better ones, if more children are born year after year than if fewer are born. That is, if the population does grow at the university, more courts and better courts will be built, whereas if the population stabilizes at its present size, no more facilities will be built. More generally, if farmers had not come to Illinois and developed the land and built up the state so that it could support a university, there would certainly be no courts at all to enjoy now. Central Illinois, with its remarkably productive cornfields, would still be a malarial and unproductive swamp. Let's consider the squash courts too. One can get into a squash court at any time of the day, except very occasionally at 5 in the afternoon, when there are 1 or 2 courts too few for all those who would like to play. Most of the day, the squash courts are used hardly at all. From one point of view, this is paradise for squash players like me. On the other hand, there are often too few people to play with. Furthermore, there is a slightly depressing air about the squash courts. It seems a bit like a home for the aged, because most of the players are 35 and up, except for those who have come from England or South Africa. Few young students or faculty members have taken up the game, which is why there is no problem in getting a court. In contrast, there is a vitality around the racquetball courts. There are always people watching and giving advice and jostling a bit and checking out the challenge court to see the newest rising star. The racquetball courts have produced some national-level competitors in a short time. Around the squash courts, but not on them, it is all very dignified and peaceful. But as I said, it is also a bit depressing. What about the future? If the population of the university grows, there is a good chance that there will still be plenty of squash courts 15 years from now, except that the players will be doddering incompetents. And by that time, the squash courts will be in run-down condition, whereas chances are that there will be a whole new battery of racquetball courts. The rundown squash courts and players will be the cost of having no growth in the population of squash players. So which do you want? Will you choose the genteel, run-down, peaceful, and slightly depressing no-growth policy, as with the squash courts? Or do you prefer the less peaceful, slightly jostling population growth that costs you capital for a while, as with the racquetball courts? Now, in 1993, at the University of Maryland, I play racquetball, partly because it had gotten too hard to find squash partners.